Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm delighted to be with all of you tonight, wherever you're watching from, to celebrate a new book, Creating Cultures of Consent, a guide for parents and educators. We are really, really excited to be joined by the author of that book, Dr. Laura Mcguire, who uses they, them pronouns, and also by Donna Freitas, who is a incredibly prolific author, but who I thought of to help us with this event because Donna has written two really important books about consent that have been important to Charis and that we have carried since they came out. One, Consent, a Memoir of Unwanted Attention, came out in 2019, and Consent on Campus, a Manifesto, came out just last year or before that. Time is blending together. So we invited Donna to be a part of this conversation because her work on consent has been really important to people like Charis, but to feminists and hopeful burgeoning feminists across the United States and around the world. So I'll formally introduce Donna first. So she has written more than 20 books, both fiction and nonfiction, for adults, children, and young adults. And among them are, as I mentioned, Consent, a Memoir of Unwanted Attention, and Consent on Campus, a Manifesto. Her debut novel for adults, The 9 Lives of Rose Napolitano, came out from Viking this April, and it's going to be published in 20 countries and languages around the world over the course of this year. Donna has spoken at nearly 200 colleges and universities about her nonfiction research and has written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe. She's appeared on radio and television, from NPR's All Things Considered to the Today Show, and she's been a professor at Boston University and Hofstra University, and is currently a member of the faculty at Fairleigh Dickinson University's MFA program. So welcome, Donna. We're thrilled that you are here. And the person of the hour today is Dr. Laura Mcguire. They are an internationally recognized consultant, survivor, researcher, seminarian, and author of the book we are celebrating tonight, Creating Cultures of Consent. They are a member of the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, the Society of Professional Consultants, and are a member of numerous boards and committees. They are a graduate of the National Leaders Council and are currently a fellow with the Institute for Social Innovation, where they are researching sexual medicine competency and provider care. Dr. Mcguire lives in the United States, where they work as a full-time consultant and expert witness at the National Center for Equity and Agency. So welcome, Dr. Mcguire. We're thrilled to have you here. And I just want to let folks know, wherever you're watching from, we do encourage and welcome questions. You can ask a question in the chat or via this Ask a Question button at the bottom center of the screen, and we will do our best to get to those. And we also love when you shout out where you're watching from. So if you've read any of these books before, we love to know that. And in general, we hope that you'll be engaged and join us in this conversation. So I'm going to get out of the way. And again, thanks so much to both of you for being here.
I'm so excited to be here. And Laura, congratulations on your wonderful book. I just want to put it up here. It's bright and colorful and wonderful. And so if you haven't bought it yet and you're here, you should buy it and you should support your wonderful feminist bookstore and Laura. And so here it is. But congratulations on this wonderful book. And to start things off, I was wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about what made you write Creating Cultures of Consent, a guide for parents and educators. So tell us the story of how you came to do this book.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for everyone's warm welcome. And thank you to everyone who's joining us live tonight. So this book really came out of both being a K-12 educator for many years and being a parent, and then being a sexologist who studies consent and was starting programs around the country at universities and federal academies for this. And I saw how in higher education there had been such a strong focus on changing the paradigms, having more conversations around consent, particularly because of Title IX compliance. Mm-hmm. And the reality was that K-12 education had the same requirements, but my years as a teacher, we got exactly 0.0 hours of any kind of education on Title IX, sexual misconduct, consent, anything. And I also saw a lot of parents seeing what was happening with the Me Too movement and really not knowing, how do I address this? How do I answer some of these tough questions when I didn't receive this education, right? There's this huge gap in learning because educators, parents, many of us have grown up very much in the absence of cultures of consent. And so we don't necessarily have the resources for that. So I wrote an article for Edutopia about this and what schools should be doing. And within 20 minutes of it going live, I didn't even know it was live on the website, I got a call from a publisher. Shout out to Sarah Jubar, who is amazing, and I'm going to write my third book with her. And she said, could you turn that article into a book? And could this be really like a resource for, again, people who want to plant these seeds, be part of this change, but need to know what kind of tools they need to gather in order to do so?
So I think it's so interesting what you said about how, we didn't get consent education either. It's not like, when we were growing up, we were talking about cultures of consent, and it really hasn't been until I know for me on college campuses, it was like 2011 when everybody started talking about Title IX, that suddenly everybody was talking about it, and then of course with me too, and it is really interesting to think about. We're having this conversation without having the education ourselves. Like we're trying to create education for this generation, the next generation, without necessarily having it ourselves. And could you talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the opportunity there, and also some of the challenges around that?
Absolutely, yes. So I think the first thing people need to do is give themselves some grace, right? That you're not going to wake up one day just because this is all over the media or consent's become a really hot topic and suddenly say, yes, I understand this completely. It all makes sense. It's so simple. I'm good here. This is something that, even for social scientists like myself, we are constantly debating. We don't have 100% consensus on all of the different components of these conversations. We're still exploring that. And so for people who, are parents and don't have that background and are just really getting into some of these conversations, it is taking the time to unlearn a lot of what we grew up with, the things we saw in movies, in lyrics to songs, in common jokes and phrases that normalize the opposite of consent culture, right? And so taking the time to unlearn that. And then books like this and yours and so many great resources that are available now to relearn those scripts so that we can then have those conversations with our kids. I think the other reality is, as much as there's been this huge kind of tidal wave of change in this direction, the opposite of it, rape culture, very much still persists, right? And so even as an educator or as a parent, you're telling your kids these things and they're still going out into a culture that's going to give them a lot of contradictory messages. So that's why I really focus on the book on partnering between schools, teachers in classrooms, superintendents, principals, and communities and homes, because if we have that kind of holistic support for educating around this topic and contradicting those negative messages, that's really the only way that we can move forward and actually shift these paradigms.
One of the things I most want to talk to you about tonight are scripts, but before I do that, one of the things I wondered about, I'm thinking about this usually on the university level, and I think it's really different when you're thinking about it, with like younger kids in schools, like high schools and middle schools. And, this is, it's a guide for parents and educators. And so what do you feel like is the biggest challenge in advocating for this conversation and really, doing a deep dive about what consent is with young kids and kids as they get older with parents? Because I know parents have a lot of fears around anything to do with sex. And so therefore, because the reason why we're having a conversation about consent has to do with sex and everything to do with sex. Do you feel like, what are the hurdles that you have to go through with parents, and like, how do you get over those?
Yes, that's such a good question. So I think for younger kids, the biggest obstacle is, are you going to be talking to my kids, my 5-year-old, about the graphic details of sexual negotiation? And the answer, of course, is no. No, that is not what consent for a 5-year-old would be. And so at that elementary school age, it's really about getting them to reframe this as going from, oh, this is a form of sex education, to this is a life skill about interpersonal communication. Right? And also talking about how it's preventing abuse. It's increasing young children being able to report and understand more than, growing up. I often, and I'm sure many of us heard, like good touch, bad touch. Mm-hmm. Well, that does not, encapsulate the wide variety of ways that children are sexually abused. And so consent takes it to that different level without having to talk about, again, anything graphic. Just saying, if anything emotional or physical goes on that you don't feel enthusiastic about, that's something you should tell someone about, right? That's something that's not okay. And then I think for older children, a lot of times the parents will have fears about facing the reality of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, stalking, dating violence for their youth, right? I've had a lot of parents, even when I worked on university campuses, come up to me and they'd hear my job description and they'd say, is that a big problem on this campus? And I'd say, it's a big problem everywhere, right? It's not a particular problem here. It's just kind of universal, and we're aware of that and we're trying to address it. The other interesting pushback that I've received is this a conversation that's just going to get my son in trouble? So, this idea of this is about false reporting. This is about anyone regretting a sexual interaction and trying to get them put in jail for it. And so I think that's a really interesting dimension of us we don't talk about enough, is that, no, this is beneficial for all people of all genders. And that I also work with offenders, people who've been charged with sexual misconduct. And for them, they are desperate for consent education, because many times they're not predatory, they're problematic, right? And we're catching them at a phase where, again, usually it's stalking or harassment behavior. And they're like, I don't know what the alternative script is to this. I don't know what the other option is. How do I interact with someone I'm attracted to if I don't do it this way? This is all I know. So I think those are the big things, is getting them to think of consent far beyond sexuality, and then helping them to understand, yes, this is a huge problem. We don't want anyone to miss this conversation, but this is not about a political agenda or anyone hating anyone of any other gender. This is about a real system that allows everyone to function at their best.
One of my favorite things that you talk about, or one of my favorite things to talk about with regard to this issue, are scripts. And like you talk about them a lot in here. And I always feel like I have a love-hate relationship with scripts. They're the worst, and they're also the best. Because you have these really problematic scripts you can be handed, and then you play them out without even knowing why you're doing it. But then you can rewrite them. Like, scripts can be helpful. Like, they can teach you how to negotiate a situation, and they can help us. They can empower us to figure out, to get what we want, or to ask the questions we need to. And I love that you talk a lot about the importance of changing the narrative and the way that we talk about consent. And so could you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of scripts, and what does it mean to change the narrative, and why should we think about that? Like, why should we work on just the language and even the understandings that we have about interactions. Like, why do we need to rewrite those?
Absolutely. So when we say scripts, if anyone's not familiar with social scripting theory, right, it's that basically we are all programmed to have these kind of pre-designed ways of communicating with each other. The simplest explanation or example of that is to say, if I say hello, you say hello. I say, how are you? You say fine, no matter how you're feeling, right? That's a script. That's a social script we have. We know what to say in response to each other. It's something, that allows us to communicate. And like you said, some of those are totally neutral and fine. Some of them, we really need to rethink, and some are incredibly dangerous. And so when we talk about consent, so often we have these scripts that compel us to communicate inauthentically, right? We might want to say no, and we feel pressure to say yes. Or we want to say, yes, this is what I really desire. This is what I want. This is my fantasy, or this is what gives me pleasure. And there's so much guilt and shame attached to that. So we say, I don't know, can I say yes to this? And then we also have places where we think that people in certain positions of power in our life should be given, the ability to do whatever they want, or we fear repercussions from questioning things or needing clarification or needing additional boundaries. So the answer is in awareness, right? The more we understand the subconscious programming that is running through our mind and we're not always tapping into, the more we can stop and say, wait a minute, is this really how I'm feeling? Is this really what I want to say? And I think the other piece of it really comes down to increasing emotional intelligence and fluency between people. So much of consent is nonverbal. We always focus on, yes, we need it to be verbal, but it's also nonverbal. Somebody is saying, yeah, that sounds great, but their body is tense and they have low affect, and the tone of their voice is telling us something's probably not right here. We want young people to pay attention to that and to be sensitive to that. And again, that really is a life skill, something we can teach. And through all of those different tools, we gain those skills to really inhibit consent in our body, in our minds, in our communities.
One of the things I've been thinking a lot about during COVID, one of the things I've thought a lot about with regard to consent over the years and all my work with it is that we generally kind of live in a state of almost unconscious consent because of these scripts. Like, you go to the store, there's certain things you do, like you walk up to the cash register when they say it's your turn, you interact with the cashier, you hand over their money, they take it, and these are all actions where you're consenting to them. Like you're saying, yes, I am going to hand you my credit card, and you are going to take it and you're going to give it back. And we're playing out these very basic scripts. And, I've often thought the reason why we talk about consent in relation to sex is that's where it sometimes breaks down. Suddenly we're awkward, or we're confused, or we don't want to be there, or there's all kinds of things that we're not prepared for in our everyday life. But I've thought a lot about how in COVID, all of our state of unconscious consent has kind of broken down. Because suddenly we're especially in the beginning, I don't know if I want to touch your credit card, or I don't know if I want to take the package from you, UPS guy. And, it's made me think, I wonder if this is an opportunity for us, because of all of these little tiny interactions have broken down, if it's actually a great opportunity for us with our kids and with our students to open the door to talking about consent in a much bigger picture way. And I was wondering what you thought about that. And sorry, my husband's eating dinner back there. I don't know. So
that's okay.
Hard to do.
No, I think that's an excellent discussion, right? It has allowed us to look at some of these scripts and say, is this working for us because of COVID? But then, is this working for us, period? I think one of the things that comes up a lot with, like you're saying, especially with non-sexual contact, communication, any kind of physical touch, is that separate from worrying about germs and bacteria, there are so many concerns about people's boundaries with trauma, people's boundaries with culture, right? And this normalizing, hey, I'm just allowed to shake your hand, or I'm just allowed to touch you in this situation, or I'm allowed to grab that from you at this time. And people have long said, well, that's actually not good for me. And that, gives me anxiety, or that really violates a lot of religious norms that I need to maintain. And so all of this is about consent. It's all about, is someone enthusiastically wanting to engage with any kind of interaction? And then if not, making sure that there's a no pressure alternative, right? Not, no, wow, that's really upsetting, or that's weird, or how rude, but instead, no, okay, that's great. Here's something else, that we can do. Here's another way that I can take your credit card, or that we can greet each other without physical contact. And I think that, all of these things are hopefully building to that different level of transformative awareness.
I just want to also remind people who are here with us that you can ask a question. And so please, we're going to soon we'll transition to audience questions if there are any. And so if you want to start thinking about those or typing those in, please feel free. And I will be checking to see if there are questions from the audience and giving them to Laura. But one of the things I wanted you to talk about, Laura, that I really love that you talk about a lot in your book is you talk a lot about values, that this is about values, and which I often feel like is a word, well, values and ethics are words that people get really nervous about in our country. I think in general in our conversation about consent for all kinds of reasons, some of which are very good. But I would love it if you could talk a little bit more about what role values have in relation to thinking about consent and a culture of consent.
Absolutely, yes. So you're right. I mean, I think when we say values, that comes with a very emotional, kind of visceral reaction of, wait a minute, are you trying to redefine what I think is right or wrong? Are you saying, and this goes a lot to what we talked about with generational divides around consent culture, are you saying the way I grew up is offensive? How dare you? That's very upsetting. And so I think, one, we have to work with that reaction, right? We don't want to shut people down when they have those kinds of cognitive dissonance responses. We want to help them build that bridge of, that might be part of your perception when you first hear that, but no, this is about a communal value that we want to create. And part of that is that it needs to be culturally relevant to different communities, right? I work a lot with international students, and I think that's one of the big issues with values-based consent education there is, again, are you coming in and telling me, my culture's beliefs or laws or scripts are offensive or wrong, right? And we have to maintain that cultural humility piece throughout that. And I think the way to do that, one of the most profound ways to do that, is to really think about what kind of teaching method, what kind of pedagogy do we want to have when we're talking about this values-based perspective. So values-based education has all of its theoretical people, and they have three main schools of thought. One is indoctrination, and sometimes we think of this in consent education, I think the most often when maybe an attorney is doing it or an HR specialist is doing it, right? It's, here's the rules, here's how you'll get in trouble, there's no questions, right? And then people ask what ifs, am I gonna go to jail if I do this? And I hate that, because I'm that's totally beside the point. We don't want to focus on that kind of compliance. And then there's values clarification model, which is very, very, very vague, right? And that's, there's no real right or wrong. There's no real definition of consent. We're just going to let everyone decide what it means to them. And that's not super helpful if you do have a goal that you're trying to reach, right? And so the cognitive developmental approach is that middle ground. And it's saying, yes, we do want to say certain things are not going to be acceptable in our community. But we're going to work with people to help them understand, well, why is that? Again, who benefits, how this benefits everyone, how this can maintain a culturally humble approach, how this can work for people of different generations and gender expressions and identities and all of these different things, how this can work in the kink community and for sex workers, right, who are part of our student bodies. And so I think that, you know, having that mindset, again, really allows us to see that consent is this foundation that we're building something upon. It's not going to be overly simple simply because humans are complex, right? And all the things that we're mentioning add complexity, but to not be afraid of that and to instead lean into it.
And I'll just remind people again, if you have a question, please type it in. I want to talk a little bit about Title IX specifically. And, you know, I guess I've always thought of Title IX as both this amazing opportunity for us to like have these conversations. And because it forced everybody to deal with the issue. But then there's also this issue of Title IX compliance. And I think often the conversation gets taken over by compliance. And, you know, the conversations we end up having are about how to avoid getting in trouble as opposed to why does this matter? Like, because I've always thought this is who we are as people. Like, that's what the stakes are here. Like, you're asserting who you are as a human. Like, this isn't just be about avoiding getting in trouble. And I was really wondering, what do you feel about this particular issue? So Title IX compliance, especially in like secondary schools, middle schools.
Yeah. So my second book, which we're not talking about tonight, but it's just interesting, is all about Title IX on college campuses. And so I have a lot to say about that. And again, Title IX applies from pre-K on, and that's so important for people to know. So particularly if there are students, there might be high school students watching this tonight, and they're like, I want consent education in my school. Try to go through the door of Title IX and saying, hey, this is a mandate. You need to do this for compliance, because often that is the pain point that gets people to take that on initially. But I mean, I think the problem there is that this was kind of a strange marriage, so to speak, right? So when we look at consent in the United States, we see that it really starts as a concept around sexual interactions in 1982, 83, and it starts in the kink community in New York City. And they start to talk about, well, we need to have some kind of understanding of guidelines on how people interact during scenes. And then fast forward to 1991, we see the first college campus starting to have consent education. But it wasn't because of Title IX. It was because they thought it was an important thing, right? They're like, sexual misconduct in all different forms is a problem. We care about this. Let's make it a requirement that we discuss it. And then, you know, it slowly starts to blend with some of the case law and the different things that are coming up around Title IX, because these are often gender-based violations of, you know, human rights and boundaries and dignity. And so whenever lawyers get a hold of something that social scientists and communities have created, it changes a lot, right? Because they have a very different mindset and framework that they're operating from. And so that's why we see this evolution where in 2011, the Dear Colleague letter comes out, and it invokes a ton of fear and a very knee-jerk reaction of, okay, so now we're going to check all these boxes and everyone's going to report everything, and we're going to come down really hard on anything that we hear, and that will solve all of our problems. And it didn't, right? It actually caused a lot more problems because there wasn't this full spectrum understanding of consent, what it means, what it looks like, what it feels like, right? Instead, it became, how do we avoid lawsuits? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think, particularly for those, again, in the K-12 space, one thing I would advocate for, and this is also true for college campuses, is make sure that the conversations that your campus or your school is having are operating from that holistic standpoint, right? That it's not just someone coming in and saying, let me tell you some horror stories and shock value and, don't do this or else. That you're having these different people who are subject matter experts talk about those different dimensions. And again, really allow it to become a value that becomes a cultural norm.
Yes, this is what I hope for. So, but the Title IX it's gotten very legalistic, I would say, like especially on college campuses. There's such a fear of lawsuits, and it really, it seems to take the conversation away from where we want it to be, ideally. So I always think of Title IX as the absolute last resort. Like you only want to go to the law when everything has failed. And so you want education to do that prevention. So we have a couple people who are really interested in you thinking about or talking about healthcare in relation to this issue. And there doesn't seem to be exactly a question in there, but they would like you to talk about healthcare.
Okay, yes. So I think in my introduction, we talked a little bit about the research study I'm doing right now on health equities around sexual medicine. And a lot of that has to do with consent and boundaries and people feeling like they have autonomy to ask questions from their providers and to say no, right? That's something we're really going to go into more when we start doing our interviews. And I think that, in healthcare, we just talked about the power differential, the power structures that don't allow us to authentically communicate. Right? So this can be something as small as a provider saying, okay, we checked out the thing you came in for. Do you have any questions? I'm running out the door. And you say no, but what's behind that is, yes, I have so many questions, but I feel so rushed. I have so many concerns. Maybe I have a history of trauma. I would love to talk to someone about it, but I do not feel that there is space and safety for me to do so. And then, of course, the opposite, which is that a lot of times people in healthcare industries, because they have so much power in that space and patients feel like they have no power at all, can say, we are going to do something. And there's no question in that, right? There's no opening for, is this something you would like to do? Do you feel that this is the best option for you? Let me walk you through all of your options until you find one you feel engaged with, right? And I think the hopeful thing there is that just like we're talking about with schools, we can absolutely shift these paradigms and these scripts. I think a lot of healthcare providers would like to, but once again, they lack the education. They need to unlearn some of the things they might have heard in medical school or things that they see normalized, and then figure out, well, what is the alternative to that? How do I have those conversations with my patients that empower them?
I would just say we have time for like a couple more questions. And so if anyone in the audience wants to type in a question, I will be looking out for those. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, going back to parents, what are some of the challenges that some parents face on this issue, but also like, what are some of the like positive ways they can be modeling this conversation, these issues for their kids at home?
Yeah. So I think, again, with just the term consent, people who aren't 100% comfortable with it, or even people who are comfortable with it, but they're used to it being in a sexual context, might think, yeah, how on earth am I supposed to model that for my children? I'm not going to go up to my partner and say like, hey, how do you feel about me touching you right now? Well, what does that look like, right? And I mean, it really, again, comes down to practicing boundaries. Mm-hmm. One example I give in the book is even like setting boundaries at work and allowing your children to see that, right? That just because someone is the supervisor in a role doesn't mean that you can't set a boundary with them or say no to them. It still has to be consensual, right? and allowing your children to see, you know, I'm going to put aside time for this. This is not something I'm going to engage with here. And certainly, of course, in any interaction you have with your children, making sure that it is consensual, making sure that you are respecting their concerns and what they have to say. You know, a practice which is kind of adjacent to this that I do with my own children regularly is I ask them, you know, how am I doing as a mom? I would love to get your feedback, right? Do you feel like, and we have that conversation, and they'll say, you know, oh, you're so patient, you're so kind, but you're on your phone too much, or something like that, right? And just making sure that this is not something, yes, I do have to be in a different position of power to keep them safe, to not allow them to eat whatever they want and go wherever they want, right? But this is still something where I am a recipient of their needs and their boundaries as well. And I have to respect them, and I have to make sure those lines of communication are very open so they don't feel afraid to say, hey, this really isn't okay with me. We need to do something else.
One of my favorite parts of your book, which I'll just hold up one more time, is when you talk about this issue of boundaries, and I thought, wow, like what an important thing for us to be thinking about during COVID, which it's so hard to negotiate boundaries, as we just like witnessed my husband bringing home dinner, like turning on the faucet back there. But I loved also you have these model conversations of how to have them. And there's one where, you know, the adult in the conversation is going through a hard time themselves, and they tell the person like, oh, I'm feeling kind of depleted today, and they model like, I need some boundaries, you know, too, or like I'm taking care of myself. And I thought it was just, you give such a great range of different ways to negotiate some of these like situations and what you can teach kids as you're doing them. So it was just such an amazing part of the book. So I have two more questions for you, and if anybody has any other questions, you have some time to squeeze them in. I'll be looking. But one of the things I just want to ask you is very broad, Laura. So like consent, it's a huge topic. If there's anything that we haven't talked about tonight that you feel like you want people listening to think about with regard to your book and what you care about in terms of creating cultures of consent, is there anything we missed? Like what is it?
So I think we've covered a lot of wonderful things. I think that the thing that I would really want people to take away from this discussion tonight is that they should feel empowered in being part of this revolution, right? In part of this change. I think sometimes we can make this, again, something that's so complex that we feel like it's unapproachable. Again, I think there's a lot of communities, you know, I know many of us are in the South. I'm from Tennessee. I live in Florida. I know in this part of the country, this can feel like something that's for other people, right? Those are for people in the Northeast and out West. That's not for us because it doesn't speak to our cultural norms and expectations. And I think that's not true. This is, again, for everybody, benefits everyone. And that if you are just getting into this, or you're well into it, but you don't know how to bring these conversations into a bigger realm in your community, in your school, to learn, to engage with people who are resources, and to get that support, because you absolutely can enact that change. I think students, PTA members, passionate educators, even if they're not health educators, English teachers and science teachers, all of these different spaces can be the ones who say, this is really important to me, and I'm going to integrate it into my norms, my expectations for my classroom or my home, and I'm going to spread it around, and I'm going to advocate for change. So to feel that strength in that position, that you are not, being left to the side or at the mercy of whether you're a governor. We were talking about governors earlier, whether you're a governor, as in some states, they have required consent education for schools. If that's not where you are, you can still be part of making this something that happens.
And sort of related to that, there's a great question that goes back to boundaries, and it has to do with like differences in values too. So someone wants to know, can you say a little bit about how to model boundaries to your kids when the grandparents have different values and are participating in childcare, especially during COVID?
Yes. So, I know this is something we touched on a little bit, but we live in this world where even if we are saying, this is totally something. Oh.
Hello?
Oh,
Laura, where are you?
Laura, we lost your camera. Let's see. There you are. Okay, you're back.
Okay.
It's the storm outside. I'm so grateful we've made it this far without my internet going out. All right, we got a few more minutes, thunder. Hold on. Okay, so grandparents, right? So yes, even if this is something we are doing at home, we're modeling, or doing all those things. Our school's got a great curriculum. There's the rest of the world, right? There's the rest of our family, our religious communities, social media, right? Still giving these different messages. I think one thing you can do, if it's an avenue, is to, again, sit down and educate the grandparents or anyone else in the child's life about why this is important to you. Talk about some of those common myths and misconceptions, right? Be willing to address them. Or if you don't feel prepared to do that, give them a book. Again, connect them to someone who'd be willing to meet with them, right? And talk about, well, this is why this is something we're going to normalize for our child. If that is just, not going to happen, that door is not open at this time, then I think one of the things that's really important is to then talk to your children about different people having different expectations, where some of those come from, and why you are still going to, be following these kinds of paradigms. And, even with the young child saying, grandma might not say it, it's up to you to decide if you get to hug her or not. She might say you have to because she's grandma. Just listen to her. This is a new thing for her. It's hard changing, especially the older you are, the more difficult it can be. And so let's work with grandma. Let's talk to her about needing that respect. And just know, again, we're going to be navigating a world where there are different people with these different perspectives, but we can still find ways to interact with them without losing our values.
I think that is one of the hardest things to navigate, is just all the differences all around us. And you have to really hang on to, I always try to remember, we're all just people. We're all just people. we're all coming from the same place in theory. So, but, we've come to my last question for the night, and thank you to everybody who's here. And I just want to say one more time, you should make sure to get your copy of Laura's book, and also to support this wonderful independent feminist bookstore. So make sure to buy it here tonight. But Laura, I know this is your first book, but you mentioned that you have another book already that's coming out, and it's about college campuses. And so for our last question, why don't you just talk to us about what's next?
Yeah. So, I think it's important for folks to know, in conjunction with the book is a series of trainings that are available if people want someone to come out and work with their school, for faculty and staff, for parents, and for students. So feel free to connect with me if that's something you're specifically looking for. And then the second book is going to be really a handbook, a guidebook for people who are working on college campuses. and want to understand where this is very much an introductory conversation and goes a little bit into depth into some of the teaching tools. That one goes much more into the history, some of the research and science. Takes a lot of examination of what kind of survivors are left out of conversations, restorative justice for misconduct. And so it comes from those different angles. And then the third one that should be coming out, that one's probably going to come out in 2 years or so when I finish the second one, is about transforming trauma in schools. So looking at trauma and not just being trauma informed, but using it as a platform for transformation. And part of that will be consent conversations, but also understanding things like how polyvagal theory and ACEs impact students in the K-12 environment.
Wow, that's so amazing. Like, I love that you're running the gamut on all of these conversations, and congratulations on all this wonderful work. And just thank you so much for being in conversation with me tonight. It's been so fun to get to listen to you talk about your work. And I don't know, Yara, if you want to come back and do your thing.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you both so much. This is so important. And, you know, there are so many facets to this topic. So I appreciate how rich this conversation has been tonight. For folks watching at home, please do click this teal button to buy both of these authors' books from Charis. You can also search Donna's name, because we only put the consent-related books that Donna has written, but Donna has written, as I said, 20 books, and her new novel is great. So please do a deep dive on all of Donna's books. They are all available from Charis as well. And Dr. Mcguire, we're so excited to have this and have it as a resource, especially because Charis is now on a college campus. So it's been interesting for us to now be a part of those Title IX conversations from an interior place. I think it's really, unless you're in those rooms, you don't really know how educators are talking about this topic. So it's been educational for me, and it's really important. So I think right now, so much about education is up in the air. COVID is reshaping so much of how we're thinking about education. And my hope for activists and for parents is that we use these opportunities to not just be reactionary, but to be proactive and advocate for the policies and values that we actually want. And I think this book is a great tool for that. So thank you so much, and congratulations on your first book. It's always exciting, and we will look out for much more from both of you. So I hope you both stay safe and well, and everybody watching at home does as well. And until next time, you can find us online at charisbooksandmore.com.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night.
Great night.